I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are so pleased to have Beth Spencer with us for a second time. She has presented for us in the past, which is why we asked her back. Before I do her introduction and we get started, I just want to explain a couple things about Zoom and the buttons that are on the bottom of your computer screen. There is a icon that shows Q&A. This is where you could type in questions, and only Beth and I can see those questions. We will respond to them at the end of the presentation. So you can type questions in as you think of them, and then we will address those at the end. Beth Spencer is a geriatric social worker with master's degrees in social work, educational gerontology, and English. Beth has worked in the field of aging for 50 years, specializing in caregiving and dementia care. And she has co-authored several books. One of them she's holding in her hands. This is one that we use often in the work that we do at Porter Hills Village and at Cook Valley. It's a wonderful resource. And Beth is here today to really help all of us through this journey. If we are caregiving or have a loved one that has dementia, how do we navigate all that? So Beth, I am going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. And Riley, I think you can go ahead and start the slides. Yeah, there we are. It's very nice to be here, and I hope you're having the great spring weather in Grand Rapids that we are having here in Ann Arbor. I apologize for not being there in person, but I am a caregiver myself, and I really don't feel I can be gone for that long. So here we are. As Amy said, I've been working in the field of caregiving and dementia care for a long time. I'm retired now, but I've probably helped hundreds of families make decisions about moving. And for a while, I was director of an adult day program at the University of Michigan for people with memory loss. And there were many decisions and discussions that went on there about moving or not moving. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of the pros and cons of home care versus residential senior care. I want to just briefly touch on the different kinds of housing that are available and think about how you make those decisions and look at your various options, and then how to make a moving transition as smooth as possible. Next slide, please, Riley. So I want to say up front, no solution will be perfect. One of the really hard things about memory issues and dementia is that these are progressive diseases and things keep changing. And of course, as we grow older, things keep changing anyway. And often there just are not perfect solutions. So you do the best you can. You make a decision based on all the facts that you have, and just know that along the way, it's going to be rocky probably at times. But I do want to tell you a story about one of the people I worked with who actually had a very interesting journey. She was living in her own home. She had Alzheimer's disease, and she was still living alone. She had a number of kids, but recently she had locked the door, changed the locks on the door so her kids couldn't come in, because she said she didn't want them bothering her anymore and telling her what to do. So this was a number of years ago when I was in private practice. They hired me to sort of help figure out what to do. And I befriended her. And because I wasn't one of her kids and I wasn't trying to control her as she saw it, she allowed me to befriend her. So first we brought in some home care gradually, and then I decided at one point that I would take her. Her kids really wanted her to move out of her home. And I said, why don't I take you to visit a place that is for older people? You used to work in a nursing home, and things have changed a lot since then. And I just think you'd be interested to see what it's like. So I made an appointment at a memory care place for lunch. And I went on a day when I knew they'd have an activity after lunch that she liked. And I took her and we had lunch, and then she played bingo. And as we were leaving, she looked at me and she said, I'm going to move there and my kids can't stop me. And she did. She got home, she called her kids, she said, I'm moving to this place and it's not your decision, it's mine, and you can't stop me. And of course, they were very pleased. And her move went pretty smoothly. There were certainly some points down the road where she had decided she had had enough and wanted to go home. And by then, her home had been sold. But what I learned from this particular story and experience with her was how much most people do not like being controlled or feeling like they're being controlled. So one of the things I always urge families is to think about how you can give as much control as possible to your relative. And of course, it's not always 100% possible, but sometimes it means thinking through how you present things and when you present things. Next slide, please. So when is it no longer safe for somebody to stay alone? These are just a few of the things that I have run across. And first, I want to just say something about risk tolerance. What I mean by that is how much risk a family member is comfortable tolerating. And we all have different levels of risk tolerance. In my own family, when my mother was ill, she was still driving, she was having memory problems, and my two sisters and I decided we needed to sort of think about that. So we were having a phone conversation, the three of us, and my middle sister has always had a lot of anxiety, and her take on it was, Mom has to stop driving immediately. It's dangerous. I can't stand it. It's worrying me. She just shouldn't be doing that. And my youngest sister, who was always more laid back probably than the rest of us, said, well, Mom hasn't had any accidents. She's still getting places safely. I think we should just wait and see how it goes. And I was kind of in the middle and said, I think we need to assess it. And so when we're there, we each need to ride with her. We need to see how she does when she's driving. I tell you this not because it has to do with moving, but because it has to do with risk tolerance. I've had many meetings with families where we were talking about moves, moving or not moving and where to move. And family members were often all over the map with that. So that is something to think about and to acknowledge to one another if there are several people in the family trying to decide this. Living alone at some point for a progressive dementia will become unsupportable, probably. It depends a great deal on family support, how many family there are, whether they're close, how much they can help. May depend on the ability to afford help at home or to tolerate help at home. Some people really just can't bear having others in their space, particularly people that they view as strangers. So that is something to think about. I've worked with some people who really welcomed people coming into the home and others who really just couldn't bear it. The ability to respond to an emergency, and there a couple things about that. I was working with a couple some years ago, and we were discussing whether she should still be leaving her husband alone for long periods of time. And I said, well, partly it depends on whether he can respond to an emergency. And she said, well, he knows how to do that. And I said, well, let's ask him. So we did. We asked him, if there was a fire in your house, what would you do? And he said, well, I'd call the emergency people. And I said, how would you do that? And he said, I think I'd call 911. And I said, that's great. Can you show me how to do it? And he picked up the phone, and then he couldn't follow through with the task. So he kind of knew what to do, but he couldn't do it. Recently, wife of a man with some memory problems, told me that she had a medical emergency and her husband didn't, while he could pick up the phone and call, he didn't know when to do it. He didn't understand that it was an emergency, and it was kind of scary. Next slide, please. So, I've talked a little about people not tolerating strangers in the house, but the flip side of that is some people with dementia who have lost their judgment to some degree may let strangers in the house, may open the door to people who randomly knock on their door. Obviously, that's dangerous, even more these days. So that's another thing to think about. And there are a number of personal habits that the person with memory loss might have that could become problems. And I've listed some of them here. I have known some people who have developed gambling habits, or maybe already had them on their computers, and could still get into their computer. And unfortunately, I have known some people who have lost enormous amounts of money that way, or by giving money away to charities or nonprofits or other things that they've gotten in the mail, or people who are calling them up. So that's also something to think about and monitor. As I said a minute ago, sometimes judgment is impaired. At some point with a progressive dementia, such as Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia, judgment will be impaired at some point, but it happens in different rates and different ways with different people. If the person appears to be afraid or very anxious when they're left alone, that certainly is a sign that that's not good quality of life. And one of the telltale signs sometimes is that they will be making phone calls to family all day long, and asking things like, what should I do now? I don't know what to do. When are you coming home? Those are all signs of anxiety. And to me, that indicates that the person really doesn't feel comfortable being alone anymore. Next slide, please. Next slide, Riley, please. Thanks. Caregiving at home. Here are some of the pros and cons. And I should say there's no perfect answer, like I said earlier, but there's also no rights or wrongs here. Whether you care for somebody with progressive dementia at home or whether they end up moving. Most people do at some point move, but some families are able to keep people at home throughout the whole illness. It depends very much on circumstances. So some of the pros of keeping people at home is that the environment is familiar. Hopefully it's supportive. People are on their home turf and at least for a while, usually know where they are and feel comfortable there. It often gives people a sense of control to be in their own space, and it may save money, although as people need more and more paid in-home care, the costs can really escalate bringing care into the home. Most people want to be at home, and most surveys of older adults asking them where they want to live as they grow older have shown that most people want to remain in their homes. And care is sometimes better at home. I think I've had many, many family members say to me, nobody can take care of my family member like me. And that is often true. But it's also true that not all of us are cut out to be caregivers, and not all of us are the best caregivers at home. Also, it can be very isolating for both the caregiver and the care recipient to be in the home as people become more impaired often. And certainly with COVID, we know about isolation and feeling kind of trapped in the home. And that can be a huge con of remaining at home as opposed to moving into a more social situation. The care at some point may become too difficult as the disease changes and more issues and problems arise and more personal care needs to be done. Sometimes it's just beyond what a caregiver can do. There also can be a lack of stimulation in the home that is sometimes, hopefully, usually better in a more social residential situation. And boredom can lead to all kinds of issues. We've talked about safety already and about bringing strangers into the home. The physical environment of the home is sometimes the reason that people have to move. Last year, my husband and I moved from our home of 42 years to a condo because he needed to be on one floor. And he really could not do steps anymore. He's dependent on his walker. And we were in a 100-year-old house that just didn't work. It was almost impossible to adapt the bathroom so it was safe enough. So there are a lot of physical things that may be true in a home that would work better after a move. Next slide, please. So pros and cons of moving to residential care. Some of the pros to being in residential care. One is 24-hour supervision. And we know that with Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia or vascular dementia, any of the Parkinson's with dementia, any of these progressive illnesses, eventually the person will require 24-hour supervision. And as I said a moment ago, some families can do that at home, but the majority at some point find that they need more help. It may be safer than home, but I have a but there because people do fall in residential care. Accidents happen there too. If you have a relative who is falling often and easily, that can happen anywhere. It can happen when you're standing next to them in the home. It can happen in assisted living. It can happen in nursing homes. So safe becomes a relative term sometimes. What I mean by family is family, not the main caregiver, is that when you are a caregiver for your relative, at some point, often people start identifying more as a caregiver than as a spouse or as an adult child. And that can be really hard. And after a move, you can just be family again. Somebody else is doing the personal care and the housekeeping and some of the other things that get to be hard. And for many families, after a move, it's a more peaceful time with their relative. Not always, but sometimes. Hopefully, in the residential setting, there are social and recreational opportunities, and that's certainly something you should ask about and look at when you are looking around and thinking about a move. And hopefully there are trained staff. That varies considerably, I have found, um, from place to place. So I will talk a little about questions to ask in a little bit. And caregivers can attend to their own well-being, which becomes really important. There is some research that's been done that shows that caregivers of people with dementia over a long period of time are under tremendous stress usually, and often it impairs their health as well. So it is something important to think about. I had a counseling client, a woman whose husband had Alzheimer's, and it was quite difficult. He was quite difficult before he had Alzheimer's, and it did not get better for a long time. And there was no way he was willingly going to move, but she ended up having some heart problems and had to go into the hospital. And a son had to fly in from somewhere else and stay with the dad. And they realized that they had to have a backup plan and that he really probably had to move as her health was being impaired. And so she just texted me a couple days ago to tell me that he's now been moved for about 9 months, and it's been a little rocky. But she said, actually, as his Alzheimer's has progressed, he's become much easier to deal with and a nicer person than he was earlier. So that happens sometimes too. Some of the cons of moving to residential care, usually it's more expensive. The person obviously may not want to go or may have trouble adjusting, and adjustment can take quite a long time sometimes. It can also make the caregiver feel like a failure. I've had a lot of spouses particularly tell me that they felt like a failure after they moved their relative. And I think we all know that this is very, very hard work, and it doesn't mean we've failed because the disease gets better. I'm sorry, because the disease gets worse and it's harder to deal with. Also, these days, many places are really struggling with staffing shortages, and there are a lot of issues that came up during the pandemic. So that's also something to ask about. Next slide, please. These are just a few of the many reasons why families finally sometimes make the decision to move. Just overall exhaustion from caregiving for years often. And sometimes more supervision is needed than the family can handle anymore. The living situation maybe has become untenable or unsafe. And a lot of families who are in a caregiving role also have other responsibilities. I've known people who were caring for multiple people, or maybe they're adult children who have small children themselves and their parents. One caregiver I worked with a couple of years ago had 3 older ill parents and 3 young children. And she and her husband were just struggling mightily and finally really had to make some decisions about this. I mentioned emergency situations and illness. That's just so important. If the person with dementia ends up in a hospital and has been, it's been difficult for a while, sometimes moving directly from a hospital to an assisted living or other kind of housing is a good time to do it instead of going directly from home there. Sometimes that works well, and sometimes the medical staff can be helpful in facilitating that. I think I've covered the rest of these, so next slide, please. Riley. Thanks. This is my list of types of senior housing, and they can be categorized in different ways, but I think it's helpful just to have a sense of what's out there. There are independent apartments and condos that are specifically for older people. Usually not the best choice for somebody who has memory loss, although if a couple moves in, sometimes that works for a while. My husband and I moved to an independent condo, and he has some memory problems that don't seem to be progressing too much. So we'll do this for a while and see how it goes. Assisted living, and I just want to tell you that assisted living is a kind of catch-all category. In every state has different rules and regulations and definitions for assisted living. So if you're moving somebody from another state or you're moving somebody to another state, you need to look into what it means there. But in Michigan, there are standalone residences called assisted living, and most of the time they are licensed as home for the aged, which is a technical term. But assisted living is not a legal category in Michigan. So I could buy a big house and put a sign out front saying assisted living, and nobody would regulate it at all. I think most of them these days are either licensed as home for the aged or adult foster care, which tend to be smaller group homes. And there are some of the smaller group homes that are particularly designed for people with memory loss. There are several I know of in the Ann Arbor area that are quite good. But sometimes they don't have a lot of staff on, so it's very important, particularly there, to ask about staffing around the clock and how the nights are handled. Then assisted living may be one part of a larger community, which is the case with Porter Hills and the Chelsea retirement community here in Washtenaw County, which is also owned by Brio. There can be standalone memory care, so you may drive down street and see a place that says it's memory care. That's usually assisted living licensed as home for the aged. Sometimes they call it Alzheimer's care, sometimes they call it dementia care. A lot of confusing terminology. And then there are nursing homes. Most people who do not have a lot of physical and skilled care needs do not move into a nursing home until possibly very late in the disease, or if something goes really wrong. There are continuing care retirement centers, which is a category that means that they have multiple levels of care, including usually independent assisted memory care and nursing homes. And that is true, the two I mentioned before. Next slide, please. So plan ahead. I've already told you about one emergency situation. I think it's really important to have a backup plan, to look around, even if you're planning to keep your relative home. Look around, see what's out there, visit places, talk to people. Maybe if there are waiting lists, put your relative on a waiting list. And think about also making sure that if there's an immediate emergency, somebody locally can step in your place if you are the caregiver, and that they have the information they need. So they should know about medications, they should know about doctors, they should know about lawyers, all those things. I was many years ago on a hotline when the Alzheimer's Association was first starting, which was in the early 80s. And I got a call from a man who said that his next door neighbor was a couple and the woman had Alzheimer's disease and that the man had just died and they didn't have any children, and he wanted to know what he should do with this poor woman who was there with no caregiver, and he had no information. So do think about that. Plan for emergencies. Next slide, please, Riley. Some things to think about if you're looking for residential care. Probably the two first things to think about are finances and location. Many places are very expensive, and sadly, not everyone can afford them. So you really have to look carefully around and see what the options are. There usually is a range of options. And sometimes that's when staying at home for people who are lower income, sometimes staying at home with help or with family, large family, is a better option, but that's an important piece of planning ahead. Location. The woman I mentioned a few minutes ago who moved her husband recently, she was struggling between two places. There was one that she liked better. She thought the care was better. She thought the environment felt better, but it was 45 minutes from her house. And then there was one that was 15 minutes from her house. And she opted for that because she wanted to be able to get there easily and often and not have to feel like she had to stay for hours because she's driven all that way. So that is really something to weigh as you're looking around. You also need to think about the functional ability of your relative. And in the helping professions, we call these activities of daily living, the ability to dress oneself, to groom, to bathe, to, oh, I forgot to go to the bathroom independently, to toilet oneself, to walk and to eat. Those are all the ADLs. And it's really important as you're looking to be clear and honest about what your relative's functional ability is. I have known family who were so eager to get their relative into a particular place that they didn't really tell them the whole picture accurately. And then their relative moved and the place couldn't really handle him because he was more impaired than they had been led to believe. So it's important to have an accurate picture of your relative for yourself and also to tell people as you're looking. You will find as you go around and look at different places that they may have different models of care, different rules, different requirements. So you're going to want to ask about visiting and about their experience with COVID or flu or how they handle things like that, and what their goals are in terms of quality of life. Excuse me. And then you may want to think about whether the place is a for-profit or nonprofit. In general, nonprofit organizations seem to have a better reputation. It's not true across the board, but it can be true. So it is something to think about. Next slide, please. Some things to look at as you are visiting places. Ask about staff-resident ratios and ask them related to that how short-staffed they are, or when they are short-staffed, or if they are short-staffed, because every place since the pandemic has had trouble recruiting people. Interactions between staff and residents. When I go to visit a place, I really observe carefully whether I see staff talking to residents, calling them by name. What's the interaction like between staff and residents? Now, if you go at a shift change time, you're going to see staff talking to each other a lot. But in general, there should be interactions going on with residents. Ask about activities and the activity schedule. Think about what your relative might respond to and when that happens. That's why I scheduled the lunchtime edit for the woman I took that time, when I knew there'd be an activity afterwards that she would enjoy. Look at the appearance of residents. Not everyone is going to look perfect all the time. Grooming is hard, and keeping people groomed is hard, particularly if staff are working short or just very, very busy. But I have been in places where people were dressed in clothes that had crusted food on them, and you just want to look around and follow your gut on things like this. Ask about visiting policies, what, when and how families can visit. It's really important as you're thinking about costs to ask about the different levels of care and what there are extra fees for. Some places charge an all-inclusive fee for assisted living, say. And some places have extra fees that get tacked on for a lot of things. For example, if your relative is in a wheelchair, some places have a transportation fee where you are charged for a staff member's time taking them to and from the dining room or to and from activities. Some places have incontinence fees when people are incontinent and require extra attention and extra materials. You also want to ask what happens if you run out of money. Some places, particularly for-profit places, will ask your relatives to move out if they run out of money. So it's important to know about that. And what would cause the facility to discharge your relative? What can they handle, what can't? This isn't a question people usually ask, but I think it's an important one. So if I move my husband into a memory care unit, are there behaviors that they can't handle? And what are those? What would cause them to tell me I have to move him? If you can visit places several times, you want to, at different times of the day, you really want to get a feeling for the place. You also want to look around at the other people and see how you think your relative is going to fit in with them. Next slide, please. So families often struggle with how to make the move, what to tell their relative, how much to involve them, what to move or not move. There are a lot of things that you really need to think through if you are getting ready to move somebody. Next slide, please. So talking about the move, I think this is very individual. And when I was counseling people, I'm retired now, so I'm not really doing that anymore. But when I was counseling people, I often sat down with caregivers and we brainstormed this together. And some of my questions were, how does your relative respond to events that are coming up? So if she has a doctor appointment tomorrow, is she likely to stay awake all night or get up at 1 in the morning and put her clothes on because she's so anxious about it? If that's the case, you're going to need to think carefully about how you handle the move. I'm not advocating that you wait until the day of the move to tell them, because I think that's not fair, but I think it's important to really think this through. And a lot of it depends on the extent of their memory loss and your ability to cope with whatever anger or anxiety is going to come up if you talk about it with them. Who should be the person to talk about it? Might be you if you're the primary caregiver, but it might be that there are other people in the family or other friends or religious figures who can more easily bring this topic up. You might be there, but you might not be the person leading the conversation. I have had a lot of these discussions with people, and sometimes it's helpful if it comes from medical people. So when I was working in the geriatric clinic at University of Michigan, sometimes I would ask the physician to write a prescription for the person, telling them that they needed to move for health reasons. And for some people, that was helpful to have it come that way, rather than from a spouse or an adult child. I also remember one man who needed to move from, he was in a continuing care community and he needed to move from the independent apartment to memory care. And his daughter was so worried about it and asked me if I would help her tell him. So we together came up with a very simple, kind of like an agenda for him. It was a handout that said, Mr. Jones, you are going to be moving, and here is why. And we had, like, it was a very large print, and it had very simple points where we told him that the management in the apartments felt that he needed a little bit more assistance than they could give him. We kept it very simple, and we gave him a choice of 2 places he could look at, although he chose to stay within the continuing care retirement community, but he did go with his daughter and look at another place, and he got to make the decision himself. Again, this is about giving as much control as you can to somebody. None of us, I don't think, wants to be told that we have to move. And particularly if you have a disease like Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, often people feel like failures. And then to have all control and all decisions taken away from you can be really, really hard. So this is about trying to give as much control as you can. Next slide, please. And then what to say? Well, small amounts of information. Think ahead about how you're going to describe it. When my mother lived with us for a short time, and she had some memory loss and needed assistance. So I was going to move her to an assisted living, and I was able to find a very nice room that actually had a sink and a little refrigerator in it. And so I called it her apartment. She knew, I think, that it was assisted living, but I didn't use that term because I knew that term would bother her. And I also asked staff to call it her apartment so that we were all using the same terminology. Thinking about it ahead and sort of having a practice run with yourself or somebody else is really helpful. I also think it's important not to take hope away. So some people will say, is this forever? Am I ever going to be able to come home? And I have encouraged families to say, let's try this for a while. maybe let's try it for a few months and then we'll reevaluate. And usually people with memory loss have forgotten that, honestly. But rather than, I have heard staff members, unfortunately, in places say to people, when they say, when am I going home? This is your home now, you're here for the rest of your life. Well, that's pretty harsh. And I think as much as we can give people hope, it's important. I'm not talking about lying, I'm just talking about thinking carefully about your words. Next slide, please. Also, do you take the person before the move to visit? It depends on the person's abilities, on their emotional state. And I think for a lot of people, it is actually really helpful to go visit. Again, if you want to give them some choices, they could be involved in the decision. Many families take their relatives to help them decide what furniture to bring or what pictures to put on the walls. Other families, because they know their relative, go in ahead of time and set the room up and make it look as much like home as possible, using the favorite furniture, favorite pictures, so that when the person walks in, it feels a little bit familiar. And by possible consequences, I mean, if you have a relative you're caring for who is very volatile and very angry and doesn't have insight into their problems, they may get very adamant about not moving if you take them to visit. So you have to think that through as well. Next slide, please. I have found with moving people, and moving myself as well, that it's helpful to break it down into things to do before the move, things to do during the move, on the day of the move, and then after. It just makes it feel a little more manageable. Next slide, please, Riley. So before the move, some things to do: complete all paperwork ahead of time if you can. And if you have any option, try to pick a time of day when your relative is at their best. If the person gets very fatigued and increasingly confused in the afternoon, that might not be the best time to take them. I always encourage families to have someone with them, so it's not just one family member doing this by themselves, because it's hard. Emotionally, it's hard. And sometimes you do have to go do some paperwork or get called away by staff or something. So then there's another person who can stay with your relative. It may be helpful. I think a lot of places now have a form you fill out where you tell them about your relative's needs and background and just basic information. But if they don't have a form like that, I suggest that you just write some notes, not 10 pages, but a page or two to help the staff know something about your relative and what they need and who they are. And if it makes sense to involve your relative, they can perhaps be involved in deciding what to take and visiting a couple of times ahead. Next slide, please. Some things to think about on the day of the move. This, for many families, is one of the most difficult emotional days of their lives. I've had a lot of people tell me that. There also may be some relief, and that's okay. But just be prepared that it can be emotional and that things may not go the way you expect. I would just plan that the whole day is going to be taken up with this. Think about how you're going to leave. So often it's helpful to ask staff to involve your relative in something or help your relatives say goodbye to you. So, because that first time of leaving them there can be pretty tough sometimes. And find out if it's okay to call and check on how they're doing later in the evening, perhaps, and who you would call, how you would do that. And then plan something for yourself after you leave, because as I say, this can be a very emotional day, and it can be tough to just go home by yourself afterwards. So think about what you're going to do, how to take care of yourself. Next slide, please. After the move, it's important, if you can, to visit regularly. And some of the ways that people have found that works well is to go at meal times and join your relative, or go for a special particular activities. I know one of the places I worked, there was a really nice music program, and a lot of the families came in to go to music with their relatives and really enjoyed that. Sometimes conversation becomes hard, so just visiting in the room isn't always easy. Maybe going for a walk together, whatever it is. It helps if you've thought through a little what your visit is going to be like. For people with memory loss, short visits often are enough. The sense of time changes, and they may be just fine with a short visit, and not too many people at once, because that can be overwhelming. Another thing you can do is, particularly soon after the move, help them get acclimated to the place. For example, I remember a daughter who would come for the first few weeks. She came every day at lunchtime and helped her mother find her way to the dining room. And she taught her what the landmarks were along the way and helped her find her place in the dining room until she was comfortable doing that herself. Next slide, please. So Amy mentioned that I'm co-author of these two books, Moving a Relative and Other Transitions in Dementia Care, and Coping with Behavior Change in Dementia. If you go to our website, which is at the top there, dementiacarebooks.com, you can look at the table of contents of the two books, and you can look at an excerpt from each book. So you know if it's something that you'd be interested in. The other thing is, on our website, there are a number of blogs, maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 blogs that are on specific topics that are free. You can just click on and read about them. Some are related to moving, some are related to behaviors. So there are things you can do on the website that are free. And I have included some resources for you that both in Grand Rapids, the Alzheimer's Association and the area agencies on aging are good places if you need a list of places and want to talk to people about what the options are. And that is it. I am
Wonderful, wonderful information. Thank you so much, Beth.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we do have a few questions,
Okay.
and I think they all go to you. We certainly could also have any questions that anyone in the audience would have that are specifically about Porter Hills Village. But the first question is, when should a person who has dementia stop driving? Who makes that decision?
Oh boy, you know, that is not handled well legally. I personally believe that every state should have driving tests that are mandated at certain points, but they're not. So usually in Michigan, families make that decision. However, there is on the Secretary of State's website. I'm trying to think what it's called. I don't have it in front of me. There's a form that anyone can fill out that suggests that a person should be called in for a driving test. And sometimes physicians will do that. Some physicians are not comfortable doing it. I think that often this should come from medical personnel. If your relative sees a neurologist or a primary care or psychiatrist, any of them could talk about driving. I know someone who has been told recently by her physician that she shouldn't drive anymore, and she is still driving. This happens frequently. I will tell you that I had a friend, my husband and I had a friend who had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, but he was still quite functional and he was driving, but he had had several accidents, and I happened to be at their house when he got in an accident, and the police came to the door, and his wife said, "Oh, Beth, please, you go. I can't deal with this." So I went to the scene of the accident, and he was very confused. It was raining, it was dark, he'd gotten confused, he was on the wrong street. He drove over the sidewalk and into a tree. He luckily was not hurt, but I said to the young police officer, "You can see that there are dents in this car. This man has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. You should send in a form or say that he can't drive anymore." And he said, "Oh no, that's not my job. I'm not doing that." So I did send the form into the state. You have to put your name on the form, but there is a place where you can comment. And I said, "I am a close friend. I would prefer that he not know it comes from me." About 2 weeks later, I'm at their house, and he had gotten a letter from the Secretary of State calling him in for a driver's test, which he ultimately failed. And he said, "Well, I guess the police turned me in."
Oh,
It wasn't the police, but he was taken off the road, and that was important.
tough question.
Yeah.
Next question. If my loved one doesn't wander, do they have to go to memory care? Can't assisted living take care of them?
That's really a question for the individual assisted living, because they're all different about what they handle and can't handle. Just because they don't wander doesn't mean that they won't get confused and perhaps go into the wrong rooms or go into somebody else's room or find their way to the dining room. On the other hand, some people will be fine for a while. If they have a progressive dementia, they probably can't stay there forever. But I think it's important, again, to be very honest with the facility and ask them if they have some people with memory loss and how that is handled.
Thank you. And one more question I think I can answer. It says, how long is the waiting list for Porter Hills Village? Is it always easy to get in right away? And I can answer for Porter Hills Village, and maybe Beth has some insights with just in general as well. We do have a waiting list in our care areas, assisted living, and occasionally in memory care. What I think we found, especially through COVID and since COVID, is that more and more our assisted living and memory care is filled with our own residents from independent living that need the higher levels of care. And it gets harder then for people who are not already residents of our community to get in, especially, the second part of this question says, is it always easy to get in right away? The answer to that is no, it is not easy to get in right away, which I think this goes back to Beth's point earlier in her presentation about having a plan and not waiting until there's an emergency, because that's really when it's very difficult for us at Porter Hills Village to help families when they are in a crisis mode.
Yes. The other thing I meant to say earlier is you can, if you're thinking about how your relative would do, you can call around and see if any of the assisted living places do temporary respite care. And some do. It sounds like Porter Hills is probably too full, but some places. Do you?
Well, we have a few rooms that we keep as respite studios, respite suites,
Okay.
specifically for those short-term stays. And we don't, sometimes they're all full, so that's not always a sure thing, but yes, we do offer that.
I think that's sometimes a good way to find out how your relative is going to handle something like this is it first of all gives caregivers a break, which is important, but it also will give you a sense perhaps of what the move might be like if you try respite care for a week or two.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, Beth, we do thank you so much for your time once again and sharing of your knowledge and also your personal experience. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we do find your books to be very useful. They're very easy to read. They're almost more like workbooks, in my opinion, and have been very helpful to many of the families that we work with. So thank you so much. On your screen, we have the contact information for Joy Zelenak. She is the sales counselor in the licensed areas of our community, which include assisted living, memory care, and the respite care that we were talking about. And she would be happy to connect with folks who have participated today and answer any additional questions, especially, those questions that Beth encourages you to ask as you're thinking about what the next step is for your loved one. So we thank you all for attending. We have recorded this session and we will be sending it out via email to all of you who are on the presentation. So if you want to share it with family, you certainly could do that. So Beth, thank you very much. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. I'm Amy Vanderplug.